All right, welcome back, guys. This is Monday Night Anatomy. I'm Drew. We're looking at the glute minimus muscle. It's one of the three powerful glute muscles. So we've got glute maximus, glute medius, and glute minimus. This is the little brother. This is the smaller one of the three, but no less important. So as always, we're going to look at where it is on the skeleton, so the attachments. We will then look at the muscle actions when the muscle contracts. So what does it do to the joint? We'll look at all the nerve supply, and then we'll talk about some of the exercise prescription and common kind of injuries and things that you might see with glute minimus. Okay, so let's get into it. So as we can see, the primary attachment here is on the lateral aspect of the pelvis. So if we're looking from behind, so this is the butt basically. And this line here is one of the gluteal lines here. So on the pelvis, if you're looking at a skeleton, you're going to kind of see this like this rough lining. Okay, so this is one of the gluteal lines. So this is where the muscle attaches onto. And you can see it's a fairly thick muscle. Okay, so even though it's a small muscle, glute minimus, it's actually a lot bigger than a lot of the other muscles in the body. But it's still very powerful, very important muscle. Okay, so on the ilium here, it's attaching. Now remember, glute maximus is attaching all the way down through here and all the way up along the ridge of the pelvis, and glute medius is kind of attaching all the way around here and coming back. So they kind of go down in thirds in terms of their size. And then we have this attaching onto this part of the femur, which is called the greater trochanter. All right, so we have greater trochanter here, and then this bubbly bit here is lesser trochanter, where another muscle called iliopsoas attaches onto there. So these big bony, wherever you see big bony kind of protuberances or rough edges, is usually where a muscle attaches, so where the tendon inserts onto the bone, gives them more strength, more grip, if you will. All right, so and then if you look at the kind of the angles of the direction of the fibers, you can see you've got some fibers are going vertically, and then it starts to fan out, and then it kind of goes a little bit more obliquely. All right, so when the whole muscle contracts, it's going to tension this point here. And if you can kind of like average out the line of pull, it's essentially going to be pulling this way. So you can follow from the side, like from the back here. If these muscles are pulling this way, then the femur is going to swing out to the side. So it's going to create what we call hip abduction. So anytime you kick your leg out to the side, glute minimus with glute medius and glute max are doing that all together. But particularly glute minimus here is doing that. Now, where glute minimus is pretty interesting is that from the side view, the attachments are generally typically on top of the greater trochanter and to the front, or a bit more anterior. So when you have these muscles contract, you can see there's quite a bit of a twist in the glute medius. If you visualize the pulling action, it's going to actually create a internal rotation. So it's going to pull or make a rotation that way. So that's called internal rotation. Internal rotation. Whereas glute medius and glute max are external rotators. They turn the butt out. So theoretically, if this muscle is really tight, it can create internal rotation, which then draws the knees inward. So then it will create, so that your patellas will then face towards the center, so they rotate internally, okay, which then tightens up all your adductors. And that internal rotation also changes the orientation of the pelvis. So when this rotates internally, okay, often internal rotation also comes with anterior tilt. So you can kind of imagine if there are reverses and you get the line of pull pulling down this way on the ilium, it's going to create a inferior rotation, and it's going to pivot in the ball and socket, and that creates an anterior rotation. So ideally what we have when all three glutes are healthy and strong and doing their job, that these forces start to even out. Now you might be thinking, well, the glute max and the glute medius are, so bigger than the glute medius, they're always going to win, so you should always be in external rotation. But however, we also have all the adductors pretty much, and the iliopsoas all attaching on the inside of the leg, and they're all internal rotators as well. So if you get an imbalance between really tight and strong internal rotators, adductors and hip flexors, and for whatever reason your glute muscles get weak, so your glute max and your glute medius get weak, maybe you've had a back problem or something, and you tend to go into more anterior rotation of the pelvis versus more neutral pelvis, or you're just more in anterior rotation or anterior tilt of the pelvis. Okay, what that does is it creates a weakness of the gluteal muscles, because when you go into anterior tilt, which is kind of past your normal range of anterior tilt, these muscles here start to get stretched, so they get lengthened. And when a muscle is lengthened, they have less contractile capacity because they can't cross bridge as much. So it means they can't generate as much force because they just don't have as much pull to slide across because they're stuck in this lengthened position. And that's a real problem, because then, as we've kind of found out, the glute maximus is our primary hip extensor. It's our power muscle. And also glute medius is our primary hip stabilizer. It's the what keeps us upright. So if you lose those two, their capacity decreases, then it sets up a whole chain of kind of muscular imbalances and forces going up and down the kinetic chain, which are not distributed evenly, and there's not a nice balance between anterior and posterior. And that can just kind of create a lot of kind of movement pattern dysfunction, which can lead to a whole range of different musculoskeletal conditions and pathologies potentially. So glute minimus on its own isn't really a big problem if it's tight, but usually if that's tight, it's generally going to come with tight hip flexors and tight adductors. And with a pattern, you'll start to see folks go into more anterior tilt. Anterior tilt's not bad on its own. It's just when it's out of balance, that's when the issues start to arise. Okay. Now, the nerve supply is, where have we got here? It's the superior gluteal nerve, L5S1. So L5S1 is coming through here. So if you've got any kind of lower back disc pathology or degenerative changes in the spine, that could potentially impact the superior gluteal nerve, which is going to come up and through here, and you can get gluteal weakness. I've literally just was working with a client who's got a L5S1 disc injury, which is impacting the gluteal nerve, and he's having all kinds of trouble with this muscle here. It's actually going into spasm. It's continually tight. It's not relaxing. The muscle then fatigues very rapidly, and it creates a lot of pain and dysfunction. And the primary problem at the moment is that when he goes into extension, that closes the joint space here, which then compresses on the nerve, which then sends this kind of neurological pain into the butt muscle, which then inhibits the muscle so it can't do its job. And then all the other muscles that create hip extension are basically being neurologically inhibited to stop creating this pain cycle, which short term is really good, but long term that weakens that entire posterior kind of hip extension chain, which then feeds into an anterior chain pattern problem. So it's going to be a real issue to regain that muscular balance. And this is what happens when we get kind of neuropathy and neural impingement, is that basically the coordination of muscular contraction gets interfered with due to the signals getting inhibited from the spinal cord level. So we've got a bit of a journey to go across. We were talking today about how to manage the pain, okay, finding correct rest positions, identifying irritation positions, or what we call flexion intolerant, extension intolerant. This guy's definitely extension intolerant. Then finding the safe zone between that, and then progressively introducing exercises that maintain gluteal activation, core stabilization. So when he's walking, he's actually getting some stance and support, because now it's 8 weeks in, and basically all this whole complex is just becoming very dysfunctional and increasing amounts of pain, because none of this kind of musculoskeletal stabilization is occurring. All right, so that's bad news bears. We don't want that. Good news is it's definitely correctable. Don't think it's a surgical intervention at this stage because it's not quite presenting with that really severe neuropathic pain, and we can get him into a comfortable pain-free position, which is a really good sign. So we just need to kind of slowly, progressively work our way through that. And over time, often these disc injuries, they heal. So one of the most important things we can reinforce with people is disc injuries do heal. We just need to do the right things and kind of guide people through it. The other important job that the glute minimus has is with the glute medius is that pelvic stabilization. So when this muscle contracts, it pulls upward and that pulls the whole femur into the joint. So you get the femur pulled into the acetabulum. So you get this kind of nice femoral acetabulum stabilization, which is super important if you're on your feet all day and you're walking or standing. And this guy I was working today, he works, on his feet all day, basically. So at the end of the day, he's just exhausted from the pain because these muscles are just so fatigued and so inhibited that other muscles are having to create the stabilization, and that fatigue is kicking in the other muscles, and so everything is just getting tired and overworked and grumpy, and he's on a lot of pain medication as a result. So we need to kind of get him out of pain as best we can. So it's often a bit of a balancing act between taking pain medication, and this guy is actually on a form of very strong pain medication. So we want to titrate him off that. So as we can get the muscular system back online, we can then titrate back off the pain medication. The problem with the pain medication is that it'll often mask the signals of pain or nociception coming into the body, so you're getting a false representation of what's going on in the body, and then so interoception is basically confused. So interoception is the body's ability to talk to itself and understand where it is its sensory information, and so pain medication basically interferes with that kind of interoception, particularly over a long period of time, and so then it doesn't understand what's actually happening in the body, and that can kind of set up its whole range of problems as well. So that managing the back care can be quite complex and really does require someone who understands a lot of the nuances of what's going on. And there's not really a one size fits all kind of approach. You just have to really work with the person who's in front of you, understand the anatomy really helps, understand the physiology really helps, but often sometimes things get a little squirrely, and so we need to be flexible and work with the people who are in front of us, because you could have this disc injury here and no neural impingement. So you get a scan, have the disc injury, no neural impingement. So then it's not a anatomical structure that's a problem, but someone's getting this same glute pain, and so that we have to look elsewhere what could be causing that glute pain. So it could be a whole range of different things. And generally, it comes down to something that people are doing habitually, which is putting their body in certain positions or postures where some muscles are getting really well developed and worked, and other muscles are not getting that. And then if you have that muscular imbalance develop, then that makes some muscles work really hard and other muscles not getting as much work as they could, and it gets squarely from that position on. So what the exercises are the best for the glute medius? So essentially, we want to be able to teach people how to posteriorly tilt their pelvis and anterior tilt their pelvis, because you can kind of imagine as this muscle contracts, all right, these fibers here, if the pelvis and the core is stable, then it's going to create hip abduction and internal rotation. But if the legs are kind of anchored to the ground when you do that, it's going to pull on the pelvis as well. And so in this case, that's going to create an anterior tilt if these superior fibers are engaged. And then glute medius and maximus are going to create posterior tilt, particularly because their fibers are on the slightly different, the posterior side here. So you can imagine if you're lying down on your back, if as you doing like pelvic tilts, anterior tilt, you're going to create the lumbar flexion and the arc that's going to facilitate more of your glute minimus. And then posterior tilt, when you flatten your lower back into the floor, that's going to get more glute medius. But you can see the lines, fiber lines will often follow very similar directions. So you're going to get both in different positions. And so the trick is not to just focus on a single muscle, because honestly, it's pretty practically impossible just to isolate these muscles on their own because they're all connected fascially as well. But you're just trying to facilitate the movement and integration of the muscles with the movement. Okay, so that'll be one thing I'll be looking at. The next thing I'll be looking at was sideline hip abduction. Okay, good. So if you want to get the glute medius, you want to basically create the two actions that it says there, abduction and internal rotation. So if you have your foot slightly turned in, I think kneecap turned in, and then lift your leg up. Okay, and if you go straight vertically, abduction and internal rotation, you'll get these anterior superior fibers here. If you orientate your foot more externally and come behind, you'll start to get these posterior fibers and more glute medius and glute max as well. So just how you angle the foot. So knee turns in, medial rotation, you're going to get more glute medius. Knee turns out, external rotation, you're going to get glute up. Correction. Knee turns in, internal rotation, glute minimus. Knee turns out, external rotation, glute medius. So just have your foot position can change the orientation of that. Now that assumes that the pelvis is in neutral position as well. So if you put your pelvis in different positions in your sideline hip abduction, so if you're more anterior tilted or posterior tilted, that will change the line of pull. So what we need to do is to usually start more neutral and get people to create those mind-muscle connections. So they're feeling the right muscles, doing the right work in the right position. So when I teach a lot of my kind of hip strengthening exercises, we do a lot of work in ensuring that we have the feel of the glute muscles contracting, usually with the internal obliques, to create hip abduction. And if they feel all the sensation in the front of the hip, it's generally more TFL, hip flexor, glute minimus fibers. And we typically want more glute medius and glute max to kind of maintain that nice balance between internal and external rotation of the hip. Because when things are weak, structurally, the body is stronger in passive internal rotation. So the femurs can turn in and they can kind of rest in the joint here. And on the joint there, you can kind of get this passive rest where you're just hanging on the joint capsule and the ligaments. And gravity kind of helps maintain their position. It's a stronger position, just passively without any muscular contribution. So people tend to go into that internally rotated flex position. It's also a protection position. You like where you close off vital organs. So when you bring your knees together and internally rotate, you're protecting the genitals as well. So that's kind of like a natural kind of safety position for a lot of folks. And also people who tend to be more extension intolerant tend to go into flexion as well. They tend to round the spine out in posterior tilt and lumbar flexion. And so those things all feed into each other. And so you can kind of create these kind of postural issues. So we want to try to rebalance that by retraining these three glute muscles to do their job. Primarily, number one is hip extension, glute max, hip abduction with glute max, glute minimus, glute medius, hip external rotation with glute max and glute medius, hip internal rotation with glute minimus, and all three together are acetabular femoral stabilization. So acetabulum is the hip joint, femur there, acetabular femoral or hip joint. Okay, biggest joint in the body, we want that on. So that's really one of the approaches to working with glute minimus. Very difficult to use it on its own. One common thing you'll see is glute tendonitis of the insertion here. So you can get tendonitis here and also bursitis underneath there. So if I put a bursa in, let me put a bursa in quickly. That's the joint capsules, ligaments. So here would be a bursa. So that's a trochanteric bursa in here. And we also have another trochanteric bursa here. So you can get these bursas formed. So bursas are designed to kind of protect the muscle from pushing and irritating the bone too much. So you can get bursitis, or you can get the tendons where the yellow part here is or the white part becomes inflamed. And when that happens, that essentially just inhibits the entire glute complex. So then you lose all that lumbar stabilization, and that creates a whole range of problems. SIJ joint here has to work a lot harder. So sacroiliac joint ligaments here have to work a lot harder. Need a lot of passive stabilization through the lumbar ligaments. Puts a lot of pressure on the lower back. And yeah, it can get pretty gnarly. So one of the things I often tell my clients and students I'm working with is if you want to fix back pain, if you can get the glutes really functional, as in get them working correctly and train the pelvic mechanics, particularly posteriorly and anteriorly tilting with the correct muscles in use, and then layer in correct breathing mechanics on top of that, you pretty much resolve 9 out of 10 problems just by teaching or retraining or restoring functional movement into the body. At least that's very much my approach. And then the last 10% is then we get very specific and then helping to restore specific muscular function and actions that may have been inhibited by neural impingement or whatever. Okay. All right, so that's the glute minimus. Hope you enjoyed that. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to reach out, and I look forward to our next Monday anatomy series. Okay. Let's stop the share, and we'll end.